Howdy everyone. So I have the wheel ready to go now. It has been cleaned up. You can see that there is no grease on this rubber face. I went ahead and put a very light coating of grease on the axle itself. Again, this is bare metal just to protect it. Here is the spacer. And again, this doesn't get any grease or anything put on it because in theory, this should never spin. This is not supposed to spin on the axle. So no grease on this, no grease between it and the bearing. Again, this is dry. There's no grease on this rubber because the rubber is not supposed to rotate. No grease on the rubber, no grease on the spacer. So now I'm going to go ahead and take the wheel, I'll slide it in place, I'll put this spacer on top, so that spacer will be on this side of the wheel, like this. And again, no grease between the washer and the rubber. That will be dry. I will, however, put a very light coat of grease on this face of the washer because the nut is going to ride up against that when you tighten it. So I just want a little bit of grease on here to help reduce the friction when I tighten this nut. So let me do that, and then we'll talk about the brake caliper. Well, I'll talk about the tightening procedure that these written instructions recommend you doing, which the van's instructions don't even mention. Let me do that. I'll be right back. Howdy everyone. So here's the assembly, assembled as it were. And again, spacers in place, no grease. This spacer is in place, no grease. Small, very minute amount of grease between the nut and the spacer just so there's not a lot of friction as I spin the nut down. So here's the thing. This doesn't turn all that easily at the moment just because it's physically resting on the brake disc on the cardboard, so it's a little bit difficult to spin. But it's the best I can do holding the camera with one hand and trying to turn it with the other. So I wanted to show this. I don't know if this will show up very well. You can obviously see the black rubber gasket or the rubber seal. And right now, there's no plate in the wheel at all in this orientation here. However, when I turn the wheel, you can see, hopefully, the rubber seal is also spinning. And the heavy metal spacer is turning as well. That is exactly what you do not want. It specifically states in these instructions here that you do not want the black seal to rotate. You want the wheel to rotate around the seal. The remedy for that is very simple. You continue to tighten the nut. You tighten the nut, still have rotation, tighten the nut, still have rotation, tighten the nut, still rotation. Now this is going to take a little bit of time because you're basically trying to squeeze those bearings into place. I can't get enough torque on this nut with one hand, I don't think. There we go. So now you can see, hopefully, that the black rubber and the heavy washer are no longer rotating. Now I'll have to check that on the back one as well. I'll have to look up and rotate the wheel and make sure that this rubber on the bearing is also stationary. So at this point, it's just a matter of feel, right? And by that I mean, how tight do you want to tighten this now that the black rubber is no longer spinning? Now it's my theory, when you get this fully assembled, when you get the leg installed, you get everything installed on the airplane and you're doing your taxi tests, you're doing your landings and takeoffs, this stuff is going to kind of wear in a little bit. It's going to take a set a little bit, and this more than likely will loosen up a little. I highly doubt it's going to work its way tighter. So I'm going to lean toward going a little bit tight initially, because the way that this is designed with Vans, you can see that the nut from the Vans kit is already pre-drilled in all of the flats. What the Vans instructions tell you to do is to tighten down this nut and then pick one of these holes, make a mark on the axle, take the nut off, drill through the axle all the way through, put your nut back in place, and then you can put your cotter pin in. Not a huge fan of that, but that's how it goes, right? So you're kind of locked into one position at that point. So I'm going to tighten this down pretty aggressive just by hand. Make sure everything is the way it's supposed to be as far as this stuff not rotating. Make sure that the wheel still turns nice. There's no obvious binding or anything of that nature. And I think I'll go with that. I think I'll just tighten this down pretty aggressive by hand, and then I'll pick a flat, mark it, drill it, put the cotter pin in, and go with it like that. So that is that for now. I'll come back when I actually drill these holes, but see, this thing's trying to roll away from me because it's dragging on the cardboard. But you know, just spinning this around in both directions, it definitely has drag on it for sure. Even when I try to get it up off the cardboard. But nothing is spinning, which is what I'm mostly concerned about. I'll have to check the back side as well. This is what I had done with that wheel. I just spin it in both directions and tighten this down. Because like I said, I believe that this is just going to work its way in a little bit. I doubt that it's going to get tighter as things are actually being used on the airplane. So I'm not going to drill anything yet because this still needs to come off to install the tire. But I just wanted to get all of this stuff done first without the tire on, just because I feel like I have better access to everything. The other thing to check now at this point is you've got this pre-assembly in place with the through bolt that we just talked about. Now the wheel and the brake disc is in place. Your nut is tight here. This is where you check the gap between your bracket and your brake disc. Now I'm not too concerned, again, just because this bracket is all over the place, right? You can see, you can manipulate the gap. But I chose to go with a larger gap, like I said before, just because that makes me more comfortable. So I am in the 0.094 plus range. Now you don't want to go spacing this out too far, because you have to remember that this bracket has to fit on the inside of your wheel fairing, right? So if you start spacing this out too aggressively, there may be some fit issues with the fairing. But I'm comfortable with what I have. That's why I added the couple of washers. In hindsight, I could have made my spacers a little bit longer, but I was just working off of the plans, so it's easier at this point just to add the washers. When I go to fit the fairing, if for some reason this is going to give me problems, I put 2 thin washers at each location. So if this gives me problems for whatever reason when I go to fit the fairing, I can take out one of those thin washers to alleviate some potential issues, but I don't think that's going to be a problem. Even with that thin washer removed, my spacing is still going to be really good. So now at this point, I'll go ahead and fit the brake caliper, and then we'll move on to fitting wheels and tubes, or tires and tubes. So the brake caliper is easy. Again, this is how it comes. Let me go over here. This is how it comes in the box, minus this fitting. Again, you have a left and a right, which is dictated by the orientation of the caliper and the orientation of this pre-installed bleeder fitting. So the caliper goes on the inside of the wheel. So you can see that this is the left caliper because the caliper goes on the inside toward the fuselage. The brake fitting is on top and the bleeder is on the bottom, and the caliper mounts on the aft side of the axle. So this is going to mount like this. Again, this is the left leg. So what you need to do is install your fitting. This comes with one of the other Vans kits. I forget which one this came with. It seemed to show up awfully early. It might have been with the fuselage kit. Put your fitting on. And then all you need to do is remove these two bolts. These two through bolts go through the caliper body, this spacer, and they thread into this metal bracket, which is actually one of the brake pads itself. They just thread directly into that. So pull these two bolts out, slide the caliper on, and then you fit these two pieces back in place and bolt it around the disc itself. So let me see if I can show you that easily here. So again, this is the caliper body. This is the big spacer. This is the brake pad. Here are the bolts. There's a bolt here, bolt here. You pull those two bolts out. These two pieces then will come out. You slide your actual caliper into place, and then you fit these two pieces back on, put the bolts in, and then they'll straddle the disc. All right, so that's next for me, and then we'll continue on. I see my battery's getting low, so let me put a charge on this, and I'll talk to you guys here in a minute.